Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Dr. Nazan Üstündağ. Nazan received her PhD in 2005 from the Department of Sociology at Indiana University Bloomington. From 2005 until 2018, she worked as an assistant professor at Boğaziçi University Istanbul in the Department of Sociology. Currently, she is an Academy in Exile and IIE Scholar Rescue Fund Fellow at the Transregionale Studien. Nazan has written extensively on social policy, gendered subjectivities, and state violence in Kurdistan. She's also worked as a columnist for the journal Nokta and the newspaper Özgür Gündem, and her opinion pieces have appeared in internet sites such as Bianet, T24, Roar magazine, and Jadaliyya. Nazan is a member of both Women for Peace and Academics for Peace, and she was a contributor to the book Building Free Life, Dialogues with Abdullah Öcalan, published by PM Press in 2020, and is currently finishing up a book with the working title Mother, Politician, and Guerilla, The Emergence of a New Political Cosmology in Kurdistan Through Women's Bodies and Speech. Nazan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Connor. I'm just going to correct you on one thing.
Please.
I'm not anymore a fellow in fellow of Academy in Exile. I'm now a fellow of Gerda Henkel Stiftung Patrimonies program. I finished that other fellowship. I just wanted to correct that.
Perfect. Thank you. Wonderful. To begin, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about your background. What motivated you to pursue intellectual work, a bit more about the primary themes that you focused on in your work, and the circumstances around how you came to leave academia.
Well, yes, I mean, you already mentioned several things. I was born and raised in Istanbul, went to Boğaziçi University, and there I met wonderful professors, actually, and it was, I can say it was them who inspired me, and I wanted to follow the doors that they have opened in my mind, because sociology made me feel like I belonged somehow. That world made more sense. So that's how so that's why I wanted to pursue a degree and an academic career, and I got a scholarship from Bloomington, so I went to Bloomington. And then I came back to Turkey and did my PhD research and a lot of other research. In my research, my focus has been on the ways in which women tell their narratives. Initially, that was how I started doing what I do. But in time, more and more, I focused on violence, and specifically state violence. Actually, how state violence, the violence of capital, and patriarchy intersect in women's life to produce the narratives they tell, and to produce their subjectivities and agencies. But later I did also research on masculinity around the same topics. And my focus shifted from urban poor neighborhoods to Kurdistan, and specifically how state violence imprinted itself in the materiality of Kurdistan, as well as in the narratives of people. I did a lot of action research during that time also, and I was active in feminist movement. I was active in Kurdish movement. I never saw academic work separate from action, because what you study becomes basically but at least in my case, I always followed my gut and the pain in my stomach, as we say in Turkish. So the pain in my stomach shaped both my scholarly work and also my activism. well, I taught until 2018 at Boğaziçi University, but at 2016, after the military coup, I had a sabbatical leave. So I went to the US. And when before that, I already had a court case hanging on me. This about an article I have written in Özgür Gündem. I was accused of terrorism propaganda. And when I was on leave, my passport was canceled. Several other court cases were opened against me because of my writing, because of my activism in Academics for Peace, because of the peace petition. And then my office and my house was visited by the police. And I made a promise to my mother that I will not return until things become less stressing for me. And so I came to Germany, and right now I pursue my activism and independent research again on the Kurdish issue and in the Kurdish movement in Germany.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, one of the key themes in your work has been violence and state violence in particular. And another theme in your recent work has been self-defense.
Right.
And I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about what led you to focus on this issue, or how that transition occurred for you to focus on this issue, and what aspects of this topic in particular you were focused on.
Well, self-defense is a concept that has been developed by Abdullah Öcalan and by the Kurdish freedom movement. And I have learned about this concept through them and through their activities, and especially in Rojava. And I mean, I've done research between 2013 and 2015 in different parts of Kurdistan, in Bakur, Bashur, and Rojava. And there, the movement was starting to conceptualize what they meant by self-defense. And I was interested in that very much. And now simply, I mean, I see maybe the concept everywhere, but especially during the COVID pandemic, it became even a more universal concept for me because of our inability to defend ourselves, because of our dependency on the market, on the state, and as women on men, and how means of production, means of self-governance have been confiscated from us, and how we have to take them back, and how we have to not give more to powers that be. These teams I see under the rubric of self-defense. I mean, basically the fact that men have confiscated the means of self-defense, production and reproduction from women, state and self-governance, self-knowledge. Men confiscated those means from women, the state confiscated them from people, and capital confiscated them from workers, basically. And how can we get them back? This has been one interest that I pursue, definitely.
As you said, you were inspired, or the source for your examination of this concept comes from Abdullah Öcalan and the Kurdish freedom movement. And for Öcalan, of course, it is a very rich and broad concept that has a very central place in his thought and the thought of the Kurdish movement. And I was hoping to read just a couple of small quotes from the Sociology of Freedom from Abdullah Öcalan to further this discussion around self-defense. He writes, "The dimension of self-defense for societies is not simply military defense. It is intertwined with the protection of identities, the guarantee of politicization, and the realization of democratization. And he writes further, social self-defense is best realized within the democratic confederal system. Self-defense can in fact be defined as the concentrated expression of democratic politics. I was hoping you could comment on these excerpts and elaborate a bit on how Öcalan's understanding of self-defense, as sort of articulated in these small excerpts, relates to how you've worked, your work and your thought on the issue.
Right. I mean, the most important part of it, basically, one of the most important parts of it is when we talk about self-defense, we don't talk about only means of violence. Means of violence definitely is about self-defense. And I defend the democratization of the means of violence. And what I mean by that is means of violence are monopolized by the state and by capital and by men, but these means of violence need to be democratized and profaned in a sense. And I actually discussed in an article how this can be done, but I'm not going to go into detail in that regard, because self-defense is not only about means of violence, but about all these other things I've been talking about, means of, for example, governing yourself. Because if you cannot govern yourself, you become dependent on others, on the state, to be so that they provide services for you, let's say. I mean, I'm just going to give the most simple example. If, for example, it weren't for the what do they call it, the roads through which commodities flow. If those roads are closed, if commodities don't flow and don't come to your market, and you cannot go out to buy them, you basically die. And we were so close to dying or to the feeling of panic that we will die, we will not be able to provide for our basic needs. But actually human beings have produced and have provided for their basic needs for such a long time, but somehow they have been robbed this capacity. How can we regenerate this capacity? How can we have self-subsistence economies? How can we have subsistence economies? And how can we, if we have subsistence economies, how is exchange, let's say, going to be organized? How are these different communities going to relate to each other? That's what democratic confederalism is all about. So in that sense, how we produce, how we provide for our basic needs, even for reproduction, right? We are now in a state where we need other people. A lot of news came out that especially racial minorities and women are doing the reproductive work of all cities, and they have been unequally affected by COVID because of that. So we are even unable to reproduce ourselves without depending on other people's work. And also we cannot govern ourselves. We cannot make decisions. We cannot come up with decisions. We cannot organize. All these shows that we have lost our means of defending ourselves. Öcalan says every organism needs to produce, reproduce, and defend itself. And we are basically failed. We are not anymore living in like organisms. On the contrary. And self-defense in that sense is the rubric, is the larger title for all these different means and functions and ways in which we care about each other and we care of ourselves, and how these have been robbed from us, the means, and how can we take back. That's what I understand from Öcalan's quote. and democratic confederalism is the way he proposes that self-defense could be once again achieved, because democratic confederalism refers to the confederalism of autonomous organizations, autonomous groups meaning groups that have subsistence economies, that have equality, that have ecological life. And confederalism basically refers to the dialogue and diplomacy between them, and how they can also be collectively organized. So in that sense, yes, a democratic confederal system is a system of self-defense.
Mm. And to continue on this issue, I would like to ask you about the relationship between women and self-defense. As you have discussed before, there is an important way in which capital, the state, and patriarchy are entangled, as the robbing of the means of autonomy, self-governance, and production from women by men, society by the state, workers by capital. So, and of course, Öcalan and the Kurdish freedom movement, the Kurdish women's movement, emphasized the centrality of women to society, as you did before regarding reproductive labor. So can you elaborate a bit more on the role of women in social self-defense, and as well, what, if any, the relationship between social self-defense and genealogy, or what is sometimes referred to as the science of women and life from the Kurdish women's movement?
Right. I mean, of course, women have a particular role to play. I mean, have a central role to play in social self-defense. But I would like to give again a simple example to explain how it is so important for women, this self-defense issue. And it has become being debated in different feminist movements. Well, for the last decade, we have been talking about femicide, right? I mean, there is growing rates of femicide all over the world. And what do we do? What can we do? Why is there femicide? Well, obviously, there is femicide because women must have lost some means of self-defense. Men must have confiscated some of these means, so that femicide increased. And the state wants us to be dependent on the state in terms of protecting women. Well, they don't protect them anyways, but more importantly, we don't want the state to protect us. We want ourselves to protect ourselves. And how can that be achieved? Through organization, through autonomous organizations, women coming together and generating the means of defending themselves. And these means, some of these means might include violence, of course, which means I don't mean by that aggressive violence. I mean, really means of violence in the sense of, within self-defense. But there are other things like organization, collectivization, being yourself heard more, autonomy, generating the capacity to sustain yourself. For example, as Kurdish movement does, Kurdish movement has opened 2 years ago a women's television, Jin TV, and Jin TV consists of, I mean, only women work there. In that first, they generate the capacity to, you know, to do all these things, including repair, including all electronic things, including montage, including regie, including all these different aspects. So it's only women. Women, first of all, generate self-confidence and generate the means to become autonomous. On the other hand, women broadcast information and programs that teach other women to defend themselves and to become autonomous, so that they can defend themselves from men's violence. Because men's violence involves all this affective exchange between women. I mean, violence is a result of this affective exchange between women, where women are put always in disadvantage and in a position of dependency. And when they show independency, they are killed by their loved ones. So, which means that women need to get themselves out of these affective economies and enter all economies, including affective, but all economies as autonomous collectivities who can provide for their needs. In that sense, self-defense is crucial for women, and women play a central role in producing societies that are equal, liberated, based on subsistence, etc., etc. When it comes to genealogy, a friend of ours was defining genealogy, the science of Webun, which means the science of being yourself. Women have been for such a long time living under patriarchal commands, under patriarchal laws, under patriarchal norms. Autonomous organization also helps them think and imagine and fantasize about their own norms. What kind of norms should women produce? What kind of norms would hold a society together while while that society is liberated and equal and ecological, etc., etc. But that you can only do by divorcing yourself from patriarchy, divorcing yourself from the patriarchal affective economies and other forms of economies. And genealogy is that science, is the science of that process, is the science of helping women become themselves collectively divorced from patriarchy, which doesn't mean that women will live isolated lives. On the contrary, divorcing from patriarchy involves fighting against patriarchy and changing man and taking those means that have been confiscated from women back from men. So that's how I see it.
Thank you. And to transition topics slightly, you have also been recently working together with the Global Prisoner Abolitionist Coalition. And I wanted to ask what, in your view, the relationship between the movement for prison abolition and self-defense is.
I think it's very, very, very connected. I'm proud of that, of being part of that coalition, actually, I must say. And we have been, in our last meetings, I have been presenting, actually, or in our last meeting, I have presented a short statement paper, short position paper to them regarding self-defense. And we have found that self-defense is definitely a notion and a concept that we want to use together with abolition. Abolition has a history, is grounded in the history of Black people. And Black people have fought so hard, so much in order to extend the meaning of that term to include abolition of the racial capital system, basically. But even in its most conservative definition, if we would define it only getting rid of prisons, defunding the police, etc., even in its most conservative way, it is related to self-defense, because without, I mean, the police, the army, all these men who have the means of violence monopolized, those are the biggest threat to social movements today. We see it today. I mean, we have witnessed this in the Middle East throughout the last decade, but now we are seeing it in Chile, we are seeing it in Colombia, we have seen it in the US during the Black Lives Matter uprisings. So the police and the army are, I mean, the obstacles, the most important obstacles against our capacity to develop our means of self-defense. In that sense, abolition is and self-defense, they are very, very closely related. They are not the same thing because they are grounded in different histories, different historicities. They have different sufferings and pains, different imaginations and fantasies grounded in them, but they are tightly connected, and the dialogue between these two concepts have opened global our movements. Our global movement definitely a lot. I mean, we talk and we think about it a lot now. The global abolition movement.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to add one other dimension in here as well around the war on terror as well, because as we've been discussing, the state has a project of securing a monopoly on violence, but also the monopoly on legitimate violence and defining what violence is legitimate and not. And a big part of the war on terror is that ideological project of delegitimizing any non-state actor practicing self-defense.
Exactly. Exactly. And both of these, of course, abolition movement and self-defense movement of Kurds have emerged as a response to this war on terror at home and abroad, definitely.
Absolutely. And I think that this segues very well into the next question I was hoping to ask you, which is about the relationship between self-defense and self-determination.
Yeah, I mean, again, they are very closely related. And I think throughout my responses to your questions, I tried to somehow link them, and I tried to argue for that link. Without self-determination, the capacity to make decisions for yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, this is this is the premise of self-defense. I mean, without having the capacity, or without being granted without taking back the means of decision making, without generating the capacity of self-determination, we remain dependent on other people, on structures of power for protection, for services, for all these other things. So self-determination and self-defense go hand in hand. Sometimes the Kurdish movements tend to see self-defense as part of self-determination, but sometimes I see self-determination, self-defense rather a bigger title that also encompasses self-determination.
Yeah, I think it's as you have said, that the relation between all of these concepts are so intertwined, and it's essentially the same themes we've been discussing throughout the conversation.
Right.
And I think with self-determination in particular, another really central theme that you mentioned before is huibun, being yourself. That it's
right.
To determine who you are, to determine for yourself, and to defend and protect that capacity. So there is this, it's like a constellation.
Right. I have been recently writing about this. Actually, in a sense, self-determination means the capacity to name yourself. I mean, we are, because naming has always been, as naming is power, and that power has always been unequally distributed across society. And especially for women, the capacity to name has been, I mean, there are mythological stories where women are the ones who name, but those are, I mean, now in our world, women have, have been confiscated all the means to name reality. And self-determination is also very much related to that, the power to name, I think.
Absolutely, because it's
name yourself.
Because it's the capacity to define what is, or to define yourself, right? So when you cannot define yourself, and you are defined by someone or some other actor.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely. And finally, this is also something we've been discussing this entire time, really. But I want to ask, what, in your view, does it mean to practice social self-defense today, or some of the key principles today, given the current conditions of capitalist modernity in which humanity as a whole is living in?
I mean, all these things we talked about, but I think like every social movement, today we face, I think right now what's happening is in Colombia, what's happening in Palestine. I'm going to say the same, give the same examples, but Palestine, Colombia, you know, we have to ask ourselves all the time, what means are available to us for self-defense? And how can we generate other means for that self-defense? Because the most important danger that social movements and movements for self-determination, movements for equality and for liberation face is the violence that the state unleashes against us. And this violence becomes sometimes so great, so scary, that people return back to their homes. People rather wait than taking the streets, changing the world. So in that sense, all social movements now have to ask themselves these questions in terms of self-defense, because we have been attacked again and again and again. We have been killed again. And the only way to go about this is, and self-defense, not in the short run, but in the long run. And the answer to this is, autonomous organizations, creating, for example, for women, creating autonomous organizations, and organizing the whole society against the state, against capital, against patriarchy. That's the only way we can, I think, secure our self-defense against the state, which unleashes violence in every opportunity it finds.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much for speaking with us. Are there any final thoughts you would like to leave us with in closing?
No, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I enjoyed speaking with you very much.
Me too.
Bye-bye.